Alright, you guys have all made it to part 2 of the basic camera control review, which means you are official camera nerds. You guys have made it to camera nerd fame and fortune. Welcome. Alright, so let's move forward. Alright, now let's talk about the light meters. So we have our light meters inside of our camera that reads the amount of light entering the lens. We're balancing that amount of light by adjusting 3 settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We already talked that in ISO, we're just going to adjust that based on the settings that we're photographing in. ISO 100 for the daylight, 400 to 800 indoors, and I would say like 800 to 1600 at night. So you just have to adjust that based on where you're photographing. Then it's up to you to adjust shutter speed and aperture to balance out your light meter. But also remember that those adjustments are going to aesthetically change what your image looks like. A large aperture, shallow depth of field. A small aperture, large depth of field. A fast shutter speed freezes motion. A slow shutter speed blurs motion. So that's up to you to decide how you're going to balance your light meter out with those settings. So let's talk about how light meters work. Light meters are not the smartest tools in the whole entire world. Even though they're giving you answers, sometimes they get confused. So, up top we have what is called a proper exposure. That's balancing out your light meter. You did not sign a contract that says that you need to stick with what that says. Because remember, once we jump into Lightroom, you guys are going to be able to adjust this exposure 3 stops up, 3 stops down, which is huge. But you want to get it as close as you can in camera. So, down below we have an example of overexposure by 1 stop on the left, 2 stops on the right. Both of those look pretty good. I would actually even argue that maybe plus 1 stop actually looks better than the proper exposure. Below that we have 1 stop underexposed and 2 stops underexposed. Those get a little dark and I don't think are too successful. Okay, so I guess the point of what I wanted to cover with that is just know zeroing out your light meter is a place to start. You don't need to stick to that, but you do want to create a pretty good exposure. Okay, so now let's talk about autofocus. While I want you to use manual settings on your camera, I'm totally okay if you use autofocus. But I do want you to know when not to use autofocus, and we'll talk about that. So, how does autofocus work in your camera? Where did your eye go? Where did your eye go? Autofocus works just like your eye. It's drawn to contrast changes, right? So our eyes follow these dark marks on this screen, right? We jump to the top left, we jump to the far right. That's exactly how autofocus works in a camera. Your camera, your sensor, is looking for those giant changes in contrast, and that's what it's going to focus on. So, our eyes look for contrast, our autofocus looks for contrast. So, right, there is no guarantee that that is what you want the camera to be focused on, right? There might be something that's really contrasty in the scene that's not super important. And the thing that you really do want to take a photo of and have it be in focus is not contrasty. So that's when you would choose to then switch your focus to manual focus. So autofocus works in points. So every one of these little rectangles is a focus point that your camera analyzes to find those areas of contrast. Sometimes your cameras, I think I just got a new camera recently, and I think it has 400 and some focus points in it. So the whole screen is covered with focus points. So as I start to autofocus, those points are looking for contrast. Most cameras that are in the $500 range, I bet have, at least 16 to 24 focus points in them. So you can set your autofocus up however you want. You can have it be center weighted, so it's only reading that middle square. You can have it on wide, or you could have it in any range in there. So if you choose one point, I would say the center point, that red point, and then you could focus your camera with your subject in the middle. You don't need to take the photo with your subject in the middle, because if you hold the shutter button halfway down just to autofocus on what's in the center, you can then move the frame wherever you want to put that subject wherever in the frame, right? So just because you read the meter from the middle doesn't mean you have to keep the thing in the middle, as long as you hold the shutter speed halfway down. If you have questions about that, let me know. I know it's a little confusing. Okay, let's talk about a really super important tool. And this is something that we're going to go more in depth with. I actually think this week with Lightroom stuff. We're going to be looking at the histogram in Lightroom. The histogram is your friend. If you can turn it on in your camera, you should definitely do it. I actually use a histogram instead of a light meter inside of my camera. So a histogram is a graph that represents the values and tones that are inside of your images, with the absolute darkest black on the left and the absolute lightest white on the right, with everything in between spread evenly across the middle. So on the left, we have the numerical value of absolute black, which is 0, and the numerical value of absolute white is 255, and middle gray is 127. And so that is how this information is laid out on this graph. What we don't ever want is information clipping in our histogram. So what we're always looking for in this rectangle is the mountain to start and end before the end of the rectangle. So this is a really good histogram right here. There's no clipping. All the information lives in there. And if you're a little bit confused about clipping, don't worry. Once we get into Lightroom, we're going to be talking a lot about clipping. Okay, so let's look at some photos and examples of their histograms. Right, so this is a pretty dark photo, but then you have that like bright light. So that's pretty indicative. We have the far left is our absolute blacks, far right, absolute whites. We actually have nothing in this photo. If I look over here, we have nothing in this photo that's absolute white. So while this looks like really bright, it's really just kind of this part of the histogram right here. Let's keep going. We don't ever worry about clipping out of the top of the histogram. So if some of our information extends above this rectangle, we don't need to worry about that right now at this stage. We're just worried about clipping left and right. This is a pretty good histogram. We have no absolute white in there, but guess what? We don't usually want there to be an absolute white in our photo. We want there to be a near absolute white. This is a really dark photo with a really bright highlight. So this is like extremes, right? We don't have much middle ground. We have really bright outside that window and really dark inside of this bar. So that's what the histogram shows. We have our darks and our shadows right here, and we have our highlights over here, and not much in the middle. This is a pretty even histogram right here, right? This gives you a lot to work with. With your histogram, if you can set it up on your camera, this is what you want. This is a proper exposure. When you have the beginning of the mountain, beginning and ending within this rectangle. That's what we're always looking for with histograms. Okay, let's talk about lens focal lengths. Most of you are probably using a zoom lens that has multiple focal lengths. So a multiple focal length would be 17 to 40 millimeters, 18 to 55 millimeters, 70 to 200, 24 to 105. A fixed focal length would be a 50 millimeter. So a 50 millimeter lens, you only have one focal length, where the other ones you have a range of focal lengths. The benefit of a zoom lens is you have those multiple focal lengths. The downside to the zoom lens is they're not the sharpest lenses because the elements, the actual glass in the lens, moves as you're changing focal lengths, where a fixed focal length lens, like the 50 in this example, is going to be a lot sharper. Okay, so in these next photographs, I changed the focal length of the lens, but the subjects and I, the photographer, stayed in the same place. So this is a 35 millimeter, which is a pretty wide angle lens. Remember, in the first Camera Basics lecture, I said that a normal lens is 50 millimeters. What makes it normal is it actually matches how we see the world through our eyes. So there's 70 millimeters. Remember, the subject and I did not move. 200 millimeters. So let's go back there. So without the subject or myself moving, we went from 35, 70 to 200. So that's how focal lengths work. The larger the number, the more telephoto the lens is. The smaller the number, the more wide angle the lens is. All right, so f-stop is actually a relationship between the length of the lens and the opening of the lens. So let's look at these. This is kind of the same idea. I don't want to get too in depth with that right now. We'll talk about it later. But this is the same example of focal lengths going from wide a wide focal length to a more telephoto focal length. And now let's talk about white balance. If you have questions about the lens stuff, don't worry. Most of you are going to have a kit lens, which is probably like an, I don't know, 24 to 70, 18 to 55, somewhere in there. I just want you to really experiment with your lens right now. I don't want you to get, I think one thing that I really worry about beginner students is they think that they have to go and buy really expensive lenses. Lenses can be the most expensive thing in photography. Trust me, I just bought a $1,000 lens. And those $1,000 lenses, those really expensive lenses, are amazing. But right now where we're at, it's not necessary. It's more important to learn how to use the tools that you have. So I don't want to go too in depth with focal length, but just know that the smaller the number, the more wide angle, the larger the number, the more telephoto. Okay, white balance. We know that white balance is measured in degrees Kelvin. I think this is something that people are beginning to understand more of in the common world, because we're now buying LED lights for our house that come in different degrees Kelvin, right? So we'll have a daylight balance bulb, which is 5,000 degrees Kelvin, or we'll have a really warm light bulb, which is like maybe 3,000 degrees Kelvin. So same thing with your camera. If you have a camera that was made in the last 6 years, you can put your white balance on auto, and it more than likely is going to do a really good job. Remember, the most important thing that I've told you in this class from here on out is to shoot in RAW. As long as you've shot in your pictures in RAW, you are good to go. We are able to change your white balance in Lightroom. If you're shooting your pictures as JPEGs, you are going to be really, 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 really bummed. So make sure to set your cameras to RAW. Okay, so here's a checklist. I want you to know all of this stuff, okay, as we move forward. Make sure to also fill out those weekly assessments to tell me what information you need clarified, because I want to make these review videos based on what you guys need more clarification on. Believe it or not, sometimes I'm a mush mouth and I don't make a ton of sense. And so if you all need clarification on the same thing, I'm going to understand that as I didn't explain it very well. So make sure to do that. All right, you guys, thanks.